There's been an incident, and I'd like to talk about it. And actually, the incident that I'd like to talk about, this is something that actually happened a few weeks ago. It happened in a game between the Anaheim Ducks and the Arizona Coyotes. It was a game that was not going very well for the Coyotes at all. Basically, the Anaheim Ducks, these days, they have a roster that is loaded up with a lot of dazzling, skilled players. I mean, they're not where they need to be to make the playoffs, as we can see right now. They're definitely not where they need to be to win a Stanley Cup within the next few years, but they have a lot of talented young players on that team right now. And despite the unfortunate coaching situation there that I think is going to hold a lot of those players back, as I've talked about in earlier videos, they are a pretty fun team to watch. And that was basically what was going on in this game between them and the Arizona Coyotes. The Ducks, I believe, were up 5-0 when Jay Beagle just absolutely mauled Troy Terry. Really for not much of a good reason at all. And so Jay Beagle, he's been around the league for a few years. He's a league veteran. But he's not really what you would call, a high scoring player at all. Basically, he's a plug. That's basically it. He's just there to, he's the kind of player that you bring in if you have a lot of skilled players that, say, you want to protect from guys that, maybe don't want to play them, maybe want to try to beat up on them instead of trying to play against them. But in this particular case, you have that kind of player on a team that's basically at this stage being beaten up on by a lot of these high-scoring players. And so, yeah, there was a fight between Jay Beagle and Troy Terry. He didn't let up, and he just basically destroyed Troy Terry. Really for no good reason other than Troy Terry's a better player. And so a lot of commentators have had a lot to say about that. Some of that making a lot more sense than others, but one guy whose comments really stood out from the pack was Coyotes commentator Tyson Nash. And so Tyson Nash is not a guy that you would ever mistake for Rick Nash. I think he had a total of 27 goals in the NHL ever. Over I think he might have played as much as 12 years in the league. So definitely he had his chance to make his mark in the NHL and never really got it done. It almost seems like there is a resentment there towards the players that are doing that right now, because basically what Tyson Nash came out and said was that, if you want to go out there and skill it up, this is what you're going to get. Basically comments that kind of indicated that in Tyson Nash's mind, one of the roles of these tough guy players is basically to intimidate the skilled players into not being able to really playing like skilled players. Which is in absolutely no way anything that is even remotely close to what people actually want to see out of this league. People actually want to be able to see the skilled players go out and show their skills. And if guys like Jay Beagle are going to be the guys to try to stand in the way of that, well, then I think that's going to be a problem for guys like Jay Beagle and Tyson Nash. And you would be surprised some of the people that this whole thing didn't sit well with at all. A couple weeks ago, I had the opportunity to discuss this with Steve McIntyre. For those of you who might not remember Steve McIntyre, I'll give you a little description. Guy was almost 7 feet tall on skates. He was the Oilers' enforcer, tough guy for a few years. He was the guy that went out and he knocked out Evanins in that game against Calgary. Just knocked him flat out cold. Basically a guy that spent his entire career, as short as it was, he spent his entire career in the NHL enforcing what other people might refer to as the code. And Steve McIntyre, when I talked to him about it, he was crystal clear what he thought about the whole thing. He thought that the whole thing was bullshit. That the role of the tough guy players is really not supposed to be to beat up on the skilled players. It's supposed to be to keep basically the shit-stained players away from, going around and just, basically, for any lack of a better phrase, ruining the opportunity of those players to play. And so Steve McIntyre spent his entire career enforcing what a lot of us call the code. And there's a lot of acknowledgement that there is such a thing as the code. I mean, it's not really like a written book of rules. It's more like a set of guidelines, if you catch the reference there. And so there are all sorts of people who have come out and said that the code is actually the problem in this situation. And quite frankly, that is not correct in any way, shape, or form. I mean, you can expect players to keep the code, but you can expect them to abandon the code, but you need to at least know what the code says about this kind of situation. And there is absolutely nothing in the code that says that skilled players can't go out and do their thing. And there's absolutely nothing in the code that says that the role of the tough guy player is to punish the skilled players for being better players. That's actually the opposite of what the code tells us. I mean, simply put, the code doesn't assert some kind of right by a guy like Jay Beagle to go out and do what he did to Troy Terry. What the code actually tells us is that if you go out and you do something like what Jay Beagle did to Troy Terry, that there is going to be retribution for that in the form of physical violence. And let's face it, it is a violent sport. It's a very highly skilled sport, but there's also that element of violence that has always been there. And really, I think, is always going to be there. And I think that's something that doesn't sit with a lot of these people. It doesn't sit very well with a lot of these people that want to, disparage this, the old code, so to speak. Because they look at the code as something that stands between them and something that I get the sense that they very much want. And that is that, a lot of them, they want to take that, that element of violence out of hockey. They want to take, in particular, they want to take the fighting right out of hockey. And they're barking up the wrong tree. And a lot of these people, really are not as knowledgeable about this game as they think that they are. Because if they were, one thing that they would understand is that when you compare, there are leagues in the world where they don't allow fighting. And so we do have kind of these, for lack of a better phrase, little laboratory leagues that we can kind of look to, and we can see, well, what happens in hockey if you take fighting out of it altogether? And what it turns out is that something happens there that we don't altogether like. And that is that you see a lot of skilled players take more injuries over the course of a season, because now there's no way outside of the referee. Like if the referee misses a lot of these stick infractions and things like that, there's nowhere else for players to turn, to get that settled. And so what happens in these leagues? Your stick work penalties go up. And even then, you're not cashing 100% of it. Basically all these little rat players kind of look at that and they say to themselves, you know what? I can go out and I can do this stuff now, and the worst thing that can happen to me is that maybe I'll go sit in the penalty box for 2 minutes. I certainly don't have to worry about having to defend myself against another player that might come and try to, settle the score with me, so to speak. Makes them much more willing to engage in that kind of behavior. So your stick work goes up. Your injuries go up. And the players that play in those leagues, they'll tell you exactly that. And players who play in other leagues who might also watch those leagues, they'll also tell you the same thing, and they'll be the ones to tell you that, you know what? We don't want fighting to be taken out of the game. Now, unfortunately, there is a segment of fans out there, there is a segment of fans out there who are some, just for lack of a better phrase, just extremely arrogant people who will sit there and tell you, and I was in fact told this once, that, oh, well, it doesn't matter what the players want. It doesn't really seem likely that you're going to have NHL hockey without the players that play it, but that's fine. Let's just put a pin in that for a minute. We can see the consequences in other leagues of taking fighting out of the game. And the thing is that in order to deal with some of the things that people don't like about fighting in the NHL, and certainly haven't liked about fighting in certain eras, it's not the 1970s anymore. And kind of thank God for that. As much as a lot of people do have pretty fond memories of the, of the Broad Street Bullies, of the, Dave the Hammer Schultz, who I've met, who's a very nice guy, surprisingly, by the way. It's not the 1970s anymore, and now fighting is a very different thing in hockey. And there is one thing that I will say that actually does make it seem like some of the efforts to at least reduce the fighting in hockey does strike me as a pretty good thing in itself. You don't want to take the fighting out, but as you reduce the number of fights, and the simple fact of the matter is that they have been declining year over year over year over the last several years. Fighting majors have just been going down and down and down. But here's one of the effects that this has on that I think a lot of people haven't really stopped to appreciate. And that is that, like, in the 1970s, a fight didn't mean anything. If you were fighting, if you were... Actually, I had it right a second ago. But if you were playing the Philadelphia Flyers, if you were fighting, the Boston Bruins, I did have that right. But if you were playing, the Big Bad Bruins or the Broad Street Bullies, you had to show up and fight. Those fights didn't mean anything. A fight in the NHL today now means something a good deal more than what it did all the way back then. It's no longer something that's just done, for the hell of it, or as a matter of course, during a game. Most of the time now it's happening because something sufficiently serious happened that the referees didn't address. And really, when it comes down to it, that's what the code is supposed to be there for. When something slips through the cracks, escapes the referee's notice, but it still needs to be addressed, that's what the code provided fighting for. So personally, I do think that, in spite of Jay Beagle... So personally, I do think that even in spite of Jay Beagle's actions, even in spite of Tyson Nash being an absolute moron, complete jackass, I do think that the reduction in fights in the league has actually strengthened that code more than ever before. I do think that hockey is better with fighting in it, but I also do kind of agree that hockey is probably better when the fighting is kept down.